Welcome to Jerry Recaps. The story continues. The players, after confronting YuWon, ran back to the place where Hyun stayed. So you escaped after just leaving your flags behind? Hyun asked. His question made the rest of Team B look over at the players who ran away after losing their flags. Their gazes were full of discontent, wondering why they didn't bother fighting when they outnumbered him. You guys didn't see his skills. Kale and Max were taken down in a single strike. You couldn't even see his sword because of how fast it was. It sent a shiver down my spine. Unembarrassed, they continued their explanation. Hyun simply shook his head, disappointed in them. These were pretty skilled players of the 11th floor. Only a few of them were truly exceptional, but they were still all above average. And the guy named Kale was someone that even Hyun had heard of before. So Kim YuWon is that skilled, Hyun thought to himself. A group of over 10 players had lost to him. Only 2 players had died, but this wasn't a problem they could just ignore. They had lost their flags, and in the end, this was a test to see which side could collect more flags. So even if we're all in groups of 10, he can take us down group by group, Hyun mumbled. The players on Team B agreed with him. If YuWon took them down group by group and took their flags, in the end, they'd be at a disadvantage. Then what should we do? Someone asked. This question put Hyun into deep thought. He originally anticipated this to be an easy game, but YuWon ended up being a bigger variable than expected. Did you say that YuWon and the king got together? The first one to break the silence was Roel. She looked like she had just thought of something. I think he was on his way back from gathering flags. One of the players that came back replied. That leaves us with only one option, Roel decided. Please contact Salamov, Kachel, and any other skilled players on our team. What? Are you serious? Hyun asked. Roel's order shocked everyone because they knew what Roel meant. She nodded her head and said there's still a lot of time left. We can't just keep running away. Her words made everyone murmur. She was right. The first half of the test was now ending. They couldn't win this test by just handing over their flags every time they encountered him. Yeah. You're right. He might be Kim YuWon, but he's still only one guy. And we have people like Hyun and Roel. Our team isn't short of skilled players. Most people agreed with Roel. Hyun kept his mouth shut and listened closely. Roel further asked, Do you guys have any other good ideas? Everyone remained silent. The players who came back after confronting YuWon also kept their mouths shut. So that decides it, right? Roel said loudly. Finally, Team B had made a decision. She further said with a smirk, Well then, the king and Kim YuWon, should we start hunting those 2 rabbits? It had been 12 hours since the start of the 11th floor test, exactly the midpoint of the test. No matter how many people there were, they couldn't stop him. Players of Team B all got scared and handed over their flags when they met YuWon. Since they were willingly handing over their flags, there was no reason for YuWon to fight them. So he just simply collected the flags they left behind. During that time, YuWon went over the forest with a fine comb. Every few monsters, one of them would have a flag, and whenever he ran into players of Team B, he took their flags. YuWon was like an unstoppable tank. YuWon obtained 7 flags this time around. That makes 100 flags. YuWon checked his CP, which was exactly 1,000 points. And if I hand this over to the king, that'll be another 1,000 points, YuWon thought. YuWon didn't trust Halaman yet. To him, Halaman was basically a deadweight. If by some accident he died or had his flag stolen by an enemy player, the results of the test would end up set in stone. YuWon would hand over the flag at the last moment, right before the 24-hour mark would be over. That was what YuWon was waiting for. As YuWon was pondering, Hawkman gathered his courage and asked, Everyone gets scared when they make eye contact with you. Were they intimidated because of you, or is it because of some other reason? Thinking back to the players he had just met, YuWon thought, This is strange. How do they know my face? His name was pretty well known. Tests had public records, and having set new records, it was inevitable for his name to become well known. But just because his name was well known, didn't mean his face should have been well known. That meant only one thing. They must have exchanged information, YuWon said. Huh? Information? Halaman asked. They probably told each other that I was with the king. As teammates, they should have exchanged their kit numbers. And so avoided me. Also, they probably promised to run away if they encountered me. YuWon trailed off. Just now, since even earlier, the actions of the players on Team B were unified. By giving up their flags? But how are they supposed to win the test then? Halaman asked. No matter how large the difference in the power of the teams was, giving up their hard-earned flags at every corner couldn't possibly be a winning strategy. On top of that, YuWon was moving at a pace that was so fast that Halaman could barely keep up with him. There's no way they don't know that. Halaman wondered. It's so they can secure certain victory, by getting you and me, YuWon said. There were now 12 hours left in the test. With half of the test now over, the dynamics of the test were shaping up. Halaman wanted to ask, what do you mean by? But he was interrupted by YuWon's eyes turning red and his atmosphere changing. They're coming, YuWon said. YuWon grabbed an arrow flying towards them in midair. The target of the arrow wasn't YuWon but Halaman. Their goal was to eliminate the king first. As Halaman noticed the arrow, he fell backward on his ass from how surprised he was. He cried out loud while backing away on his ass. YuWon crushed the arrow in his hand. He already knew that the enemy team was to pinpoint them and then try to ambush them in one go. YuWon turned his head towards the source of the arrow. YuWon looked around. Some were quite far away, but a large number of players were surrounding him. It must be Heaven's Net, YuWon thought. Meaning a net woven with the skies, the Heaven's Net was a technique long used in the martial realm to surround someone. YuWon was surrounded by a large number of players from Team B. From a rough estimate, there were at least 50 players present, with none of them being easy pushovers. Even the arrow that was aimed at Halaman just now was very fast and accurate. Among them were some players that YuWon had let go. I guess I should have just killed all of them, YuWon said. Halaman, eyes filled with fear, looked over at YuWon. To be able to say something so brazen so casually while in this situation. YuWon appeared way too laid back and reliable at the same time. Halaman gulped. He asked YuWon as calmly as he could, what do we do now? What do you think? After speaking, YuWon drew his sword and raised it high. Halakum was scared out of wits. Wait. YuWon SSI? YuWon then flicked his sword around. Within a single blink, a circle had been drawn around Halaman. Don't leave this circle. The moment you leave, consider yourself dead, YuWon warned Halaman. What? From here? Halaman responded. Halaman looked around his surroundings. They were inside a forest, but he was standing in a relatively open spot. The reason why the archer from Team B aimed at him in this situation was likely due to the terrain advantage. So Halaman couldn't understand YuWon's order to stand out in the open rather than hide deeper into the forest. Are you telling me to die right now? He asked. Who told you to die? I'm just telling you to stand there and don't leave, YuWon said. He further explained, I told you at the start as well. I told you not to die while wandering around, and you almost got yourself killed because you moved around. That comment from YuWon shut Halaman up. YuWon was right. He had warned him to stay still at the starting point, yet, unable to properly understand YuWon's instructions, Halaman went off to search for flags with his companions. If you do that again, I can't help you this time, YuWon told him firmly. Halaman grunted while looking down at the floor. It was a small circle, only about 4 meters in diameter. It was small enough to leave with just a few steps. So I just have to stay in this circle? Halaman asked. YuWon cut off Halaman, and he started to get a move on. Halaman was shocked. Despite telling him to stay still, why was YuWon moving? Where are you going? Halaman shouted. He was so shocked, he almost chased after YuWon like a child that was being abandoned. YuWon turned his head around and said circle. With that single word, Halaman stopped in his tracks. The line was right in front of his foot. Don't leave the circle, YuWon warned him. Unable to do anything, Halaman just blanked out while standing. He felt as if he had been thrown into the middle of a den of beasts. Players of Team B whispered to each other. 55 people, that was the number of players deployed to get YuWon and the king, but they were all primarily here to defeat YuWon. He blocked it. Why would you aim for the king first? There's no way something like this would have worked on YuWon. The king has to be present, so he's at a disadvantage while fighting since he has to protect the king. That's true. Without a king, even the great YuWon won't be able to do a thing. As they were chattering, another one spoke. He's moving, he's coming deeper into the forest, said one of the players who was observing YuWon and the king with his recon skills. This woke up players from their happy daydreams, making them focus back on the situation at hand. Is he running away? The player named Var asked. I think he's intending to fight, but the player observing YuWon trailed off, his eyes widening. Annoyed, Var pressed him, but what? The player observing spoke in a disheveled voice. He's leaving the king behind and moving alone. They had heard that YuWon and the king were moving together, which was true, so it confused Var why he suddenly changed tactics now. Var quickly set that confusion aside, smirking. Move aside a second, Var said, standing up from his spot and pushing two players aside. Var grabbed the spear he had set down on the ground. The spear was over 2 meters long, thick, and made entirely of steel. This is incredible, thought Var. He was one of the players of Team B, and he was amazed by all the players that had come together for this task. They were all players that he had only ever heard of. Especially Hyun and Roel. They were like stars to the players of the lower floors. To be able to form a party with them. The achievement of defeating YuWon is definitely going to help my career. If I can leverage that properly, I might even be able to attract the attention of bigger guilds. Var thought. The fact that he was a part of this party boosted his confidence. Var was also somewhat known on the lower floors for his strength. With a bit of recognition himself, he was certainly qualified to be a part of the party. It was a fact that many guilds were observing this test. This was plainly obvious to any player who knew even a little bit about how things went in the tower. Var held up his weapon and got into position to throw his spear. Arrows are weak, Var stated. His grip tightened, and his arm muscles bulged. As if he was becoming a giant bow being drawn, his back bent far backward. The spear shot out of Var's hand. An excellent marksman can know if their shot will hit even before they fires their gun, and a spearman knows if their throw will hit the moment the spear leaves their hand. And in this moment, Var was certain. It's going to hit. Var smirked. He just became the one who led their team to victory. He had become the great spear thrower Var. Huh! Var exclaimed while watching his accelerating spear. The spear suddenly stopped, floating in midair. Var said, What the? One of Var's teammates asked, What's going on? A chilling sound came from right beside Var. He looked over, and the teammate who was standing right beside him was now missing half his head. This is... Var inspected the wound. It was a wound inflicted by a piercing spear. Could it be? Var quickly turned his head, seeing that the spear that was in midair had disappeared. Another teammate shouted, Var! Over here. The teammate let out a choking sound. Var looked over, and he saw his teammate's body floating in midair. Anyone who wasn't brain dead could tell that something was there. Who are you? Var spoke in a trembling voice. So this side was a dud. From thin air, the form of a person appeared holding Var's teammate by the neck, inflicting pain. Bones broke from the powerful grip. The two teammates accompanying him were dead. The one who crushed his teammate by the neck turned to Var and slowly walked over. Var backed off as he recognized the person to be Kim YuWon. Now tell me, YuWon asked, crimson eyes flashing, where is Namgung-hoon? Somewhere far away in the deep forest, some players were gathered, among them was Salamov. He opened his eyes. His eyes had turned white, and he was able to see hundreds of meters around him. Salamov was a well-known recon player on the lower floors. He's gone, he said. What? His teammate asked. Salamov nodded his head. He had his sights on YuWon just a moment ago, and then he suddenly disappeared. Is there any way we can find him? The team members asked. Salamov shook his head. His skill, the 1,000-mile eyes, was a rare skill that, depending on the proficiency, could literally see as far as 1,000 miles, and it was even capable of seeing through most stealth. Yet Salamov couldn't see even a trace of YuWon. Salamov spoke with a frown. I can't say for certain without getting closer, but I don't think this is an ordinary stealth. It must be a pretty powerful skill. I can't even see a shimmer, Salamov explained. His explanation left his teammates in shock. Kim YuWon was an assassin? Said one of the players. That was the natural conclusion one would come to. However, Salamov shook his head. I don't think that's the case. Assassins typically don't wield long swords. Not to mention that they intentionally wear dark clothes, he said. Then what is it? My guess is... Salamov trailed off, turning his head quickly. Salamov's eyes were still white, meaning his 1,000-mile eyes were still active. Is that the 1,000-mile eyes? You have a pretty good skill, YuWon said, revealing himself. When did you get all the way here? Salamov asked while backing away. His question shocked his teammates, making them draw their weapons. There was a faint shimmer in the direction of Salamov's gaze. Salamov's teammates breathed a sigh of relief. If Salamov wasn't present, they would have all been assassinated without knowing what was going on. There's a stealth skill that I couldn't see through with the 1,000-mile eyes at this distance? Salamov couldn't believe it. He wondered if perhaps YuWon really was a player specialized in assassination. Let's hope that is the case. Because if he's not an assassin, and he can use stealth at this distance, gulped Salamov, it'll be close to impossible to defeat him. Maybe it's because you guys don't have a lot of people, but your heaven's net is too flawed, said YuWon while looking around. Even if it's you, now that you've revealed yourself, you can't do a thing, Salamov told YuWon. This was a stage prepared for YuWon. It was a wise choice to separate yourself from the king, since you can't fight us at full power if you're protecting someone, said Salamov. YuWon was looking elsewhere during Salamov's explanation. This made Salamov frown. He took a step towards YuWon. Salamov shouted, Hey, are you listening to me? A chill went down Salamov's spine, shutting him up and making him take a step back. Finally, YuWon's gaze looked to Salamov. You have good instincts, YuWon complimented. Salamov looked down at the ground in front of him. There was a fresh cut on the ground. Salamov gulped, realizing the danger of moving recklessly. Suddenly, people started to appear out of the forest. YuWon turned to look at the players. There were roughly 20 players, most of whom he didn't recognize. The only two faces that YuWon did recognize were Hyun's and Roel's. Hyun, the genius of the Namgung clan who was expected to become a high ranker one day, and Roel, the one nicknamed an angel because people say that she was blessed by God. YuWon knew their faces because both would become rankers in the future. You abandoned your king, Hyun said while raising his great sword. So you chose to battle over the test. Being capable of lifting a heavy great sword with one hand made Hyun look reliable. Hyun walked toward YuWon, getting even closer than where Salamov was. Considering his skills and the length of his sword, Hyun was now more than capable of reaching YuWon with his sword, yet YuWon didn't stop him. YuWon could tell by the atmosphere. Namgung Hyun. He was essentially the one leading Team B. I'm sorry that it's come to this. Hyun apologized, bowing his head to YuWon. What do you mean? YuWon asked. Hyun responded, though unintentional, I have a good team, unlike you. Hyun turned his head and looked around. I'm not ashamed of this situation because this is a test. You are certainly a very skilled player. It's just that your luck didn't match your skills, he said. What are you trying to say? YuWon asked. Give up on the test. I don't want to have a match like this. Hyun replied. YuWon smirked, telling him to give up. He was wondering what Hyun was on about, but for it to have been this. You're more talkative than I heard, YuWon said, raising his sword and displaying how he had zero intentions of giving up on the test. Hyun let out a sigh. He had expected this, but he was still disappointed. It seemed that things had to happen this way. I guess it can't be helped then, Hyun said while also raising his sword. As if they had made an agreement ahead of time, the other players did not intervene. It was a 1v1 situation. YuWon hummed while letting out a small laugh. Hyun didn't have a bad personality. Back then and now. His personality is still the same, YuWon thought to himself. Hyun had a cool-headed personality. He was rational and made quick judgments. It was how he was able to climb the tower quickly and become a ranker. And on top of that, Hyun was not a coward. And YuWon liked people like him, so if possible, he didn't want to kill him. I don't really care how many people there are, YuWon said. That makes me feel a bit better, Hyun said, taking a step toward YuWon. Hyun started moving towards YuWon. YuWon also charged towards him. In that moment, Hyun's sword drew an arc and their swords clashed. The heavy greatsword exerted a lot of pressure, making YuWon's eyes light up. Would you look at that, YuWon thought. He knew very well that the Namgung clan's sword was heavy because in his past life he took the 10th floor's test with the Namgung clan. I guess he's a gem for a reason, YuWon thought to himself, impressed by the strength of a player who was currently only on the 11th floor. It made him genuinely curious about what Hyun's stats were. Hyun let out a deep breath, swinging his sword repeatedly. There was no reason that a heavy sword had to be slow. As an example of this, Hyun's sword was quick and moved with the full extent of his strength. The players watched the fight in a daze, wondering how Hyun could put so much strength into his swings while moving so fast. Watching Hyun made YuWon think, he's definitely a martial arts genius. YuWon was called a genius plenty as well, but he was not as much of a genius as Hyun when it came to martial arts. Not bad, YuWon remarked. Hyun's sword was deflected, making it swing upwards. His eyes widened from the pain that made him think his hand was about to break. What is this strength? Hyun wondered. His hands were numb, making him almost lose his grip on his sword. The Namgung clan's sword was heavy. The clan's imperial sword form had a power that could exert pressure on one's surroundings just by wielding the sword. And this principle was naturally baked into Hyun's sword techniques. What's going on? Hyun was confused. On the other hand, YuWon was enjoying his fight with Namgung Hyun. Once again, Hyun's sword was deflected. When his sword clashed with YuWon's sword, it felt like both his feet got lifted off the ground. There was an unbelievable difference in power. I can't believe I'm being pushed back in terms of strength, Hyun thought while gritting his teeth. A blue shimmer started blooming around Hyun's sword. And at the same time, an enormous, mountain-like power was imbued into his sword. Hyun grunted. An unexpected power strengthened Hyun and his sword. YuWon and Hyun's swords collided with each other. Despite swinging with his all, YuWon's sword didn't budge an inch. But what preoccupied Hyun's mind the most were the messages that popped up a moment ago. Archangel's blessing empowers you. Your strength and constitution increase. Hyun turned his head and saw that the tip of Roel's hand was pointing towards him. With an exchange of sword swings, Hyun and YuWon ended up some distance away from each other. Hyun took this chance to glare at Roel. What is the meaning of this? He asked. He had made it clear that he'd first fight YuWon on one. This is all you can do even after receiving my buff. Doesn't that mean this match is already over? Roel said. Hyun grits his teeth. He was completely uninjured, meaning the fight was only just starting for him. It's far from over yet. Hyun argued. It looks like he thinks it's over though, Roel replied. What do you mean that it is over? Hyun said. Just then he turned his head when he felt a wave of heat on his face. Hyun's eyes flickered as he looked at YuWon. It was an extremely hot fire, but what really caught his attention wasn't the heat. That fire is... Hyun thought to himself. A purple fire had appeared around YuWon, making Hyun think back to a scene. Agria's dungeon. Hyun's eyes widened. Could it be? Hyun thought, recollecting the traces left behind at Agria's dungeon. He could vividly remember the wounds left on the dungeon's boss, the Spider Queen Agria. The sword wounds so sharp, precise, and destructive that it made him wonder if it was the doing of a ranker. So why, he wondered. Purple flames were not common. At the very least, Hyun had never seen or heard of them before. This can't be a mere coincidence, Hyun thought. He looked at YuWon, who was smirking at the moment, and pondered. He is the guy from back then. The sword that he felt when he traded blows with YuWon was completely different from what had made the cut on Agria's body. With YuWon's power, it should have been impossible to cut the dungeon's boss with a single strike. That left only two possibilities. Either I'm mistaken, or he was going easy against me, Hyun concluded. Hyun's eyes widened as he came to this conclusion. Judging by how YuWon's response didn't change from before or after Royal's buff, he had an idea of what the truth might be. Hyun gritted his teeth. The duel was basically over, and if YuWon really was the one who conquered Agria's dungeon, it was not possible to defeat him. Let's retreat, Hyun spoke to Roel using sonic telepathy. Roel turned her head towards Hyun in shock. She then glared at him in confusion. She couldn't understand why he wanted them to retreat. If YuWon is the same person as the one I'm thinking of, this fight is meaningless. Hyun continued speaking in secrecy to Roel, staring at the purple fire floating around YuWon. We will all die. Roel was at a crossroads with how certain Hyun sounded. Roel wondered what could possibly make Hyun suggest that they retreat first. YuWon looked back and forth between Roel and Hyun. After standing still for a moment, his eyes now red, he took a step toward them and asked, Are you guys done talking? Hyun flinched in surprise before nodding his head. YuWon noticed he was communicating with Roel through sonic telepathy, yet he waited for them. Can I ask you a question? Said Hyun. YuWon stopped in his tracks and nodded. If it's only one question. Are you the one who conquered Agria's dungeon? Hyun asked. Agria's dungeon was a difficult dungeon that hadn't been conquered in a long time. The fact that the dungeon was conquered was shocking, but the players could accept that it had happened, considering it was YuWon. What if I tell you that it was? YuWon answered. So I was right, Hyun responded. At that moment, he was able to, by proxy, get a taste of YuWon's true strength. YuWon was confused as to what had happened, but he too did not want to fight Namgung Hyun unless needed. Hyun sheathed his sword. All the players started mumbling. There was quite a huge commotion due to truth which unfolded. Agria, the highest level dungeon which we went to. So Kim YuWon was the one who defeated it. Players of Team B started chattering in disbelief. Hyun headed to Team B's original starting point. His teammates were busy trying to gauge the situation. They initially left according to Hyun's will, but they wondered if this was really okay. Are you really going to give up? One of Hyun's teammates asked. The question prompted Hyun to stop in his tracks and turn around. What do you mean? Hyun asked. The teammate who asked the question was surprised. He didn't think Hyun would go as far as to stop and turn around. It's not like you. Not like me? Hyun wondered. I get that the opponent is really strong, but it's not like you to give up without even properly fighting. Hyun let out a sigh. His teammate wasn't wrong. He hadn't lived that long of a life, but this was the first time this had happened as well. I didn't like it, he said. Hyun continued, passing the test like this and making YuWon fail like this. Hyun commanded his teammates, and looking at Roel he said, If you guys want to fight him, we're out. Let's go. Hyun's unexpected actions made his shocked teammates chase after him. Roel bit her lip from the sudden development. You're a coward, unlike the rumors, she insulted Hyun. Feel free to say whatever you want, Hyun said while looking back at YuWon. I value my teammates' lives more than my pride. Even if the entirety of Team B fought YuWon at once and somehow managed to defeat him. At least half, no, most of us would die, Hyun predicted, and he didn't want to pass the test like that. From the beginning, he didn't like this test, so quitting here was an option in itself. Hyun's teammates were touched by his statement. In response, Hyun waved at them to hurry up. YuWon had no intention of stopping them. Hyun's explanation made his teammates nod in agreement. To begin with, this test's roster made no sense. The difference between Team A and Team B was ridiculously unbalanced. Despite that, YuWon was making up for that gap by himself. So based purely on skills, YuWon was more than qualified to be one to move on to the next floor. You're too uptight. But he's got a point. I guess there's always the next test. It seems like a waste to let our team luck go like this, but this is why I like you. Hyun's teammates weren't all that disappointed because as long as they had the skills, they could always move to the next floor with the next test. A smile of satisfaction bloomed on Hyun's face. Damn it, Roel muttered with a frown, watching Hyun and his teammates walk away. Now there were only 40 members of Team B present. They still outnumbered YuWon greatly, but the absence of Hyun was a huge loss as he was the most skilled player on Team B. Still, Roel thought while looking over at YuWon. He was truly delectable-looking prey. With Hyun gone, if they could defeat YuWon, the glory would be all hers. What should we do? We still outnumber him. Damn it. Maybe I should have left with Hyun. The remaining players started murmuring. There were many hesitating, but no one was actually giving up. This was thanks to the power rising within them that filled them with courage. I'm saying this just in case, but don't kill too many kids. It's unsightly for an adult to run amok in the middle of children fighting, said the hero Hercules. Even in the middle of the meeting to pick who would go back in time, Hercules was worried about the players' lives. They are the guys that we need to fight the outers together later. I don't know who we're sending, but whoever it may be, they're bound to run into some future rankers. And that will be a loss for our side. It was a promise made in the middle of the meeting. As long as it was within their abilities, they would climb the tower in a way that saved players rather than killed them. Because at the end of the day, it was the inners, the beings inside the tower, that had to fight against the outers. So if possible, they had to avoid killing players and rankers. So no one else wants to give up. TCH, YuWon said in disappointment. He had hoped that more would change their minds with Hyun leaving. That is what I'm supposed to do, YuWon thought. But what can I do when they're baring their fangs so much? YuWon thought. Hercules insisted that they should save people rather than kill them, and Hercules would have indeed figured out a way. However, YuWon was different. I can't guarantee anything. YuWon liked Hercules for being a hero, but he himself could not be one. Roel instantly activated her skilled divine blessing and buffed her entire team. She then commanded her team to attack him altogether. The players started charging towards YuWon. The fire around YuWon started to grow more intense. In response, the players on Team B started to prepare their skills one by one. I'll give it my best shot, but if it can't be helped, it can't be helped, YuWon thought. It was now time for him to butt into a children's fight. Just as the players were charging at YuWon, the divine blessing skill that Roel used got engulfed by the divine fire and disappeared, which caused the players to stop in their tracks. They were stunned in place, confused. Roel shouted from far away at the players who were stunned in place. The skill was blocked by fire. Just break through it, he is alone anyway. Just as the players started to get their courage and hope up, their eyes flickered, they could just stare in YuWon's direction. YuWon's will made the fire roar bigger. The fire enveloping YuWon's body opened its mouth. It seemed like a huge demon broke out to engulf all the players. Hot! Someone save me! It's a demon! Go away! The entire place had erupted into chaos. Despite the name Holy Fire, YuWon looked like a demon to the players. But that was inevitable. That's just how the power of an outer is, YuWon thought to himself. The power of an outer was a power from outside the tower. People had an instinctive fear of the unknown. The Holy Fire was a foreign power to them, so it evolved into what they feared the most. And so the Holy Fire grew by consuming their fear to grow larger. This made YuWon's job not to make the flame bigger but to control it and rein it in. If the fire grows too big, it'll become hard even for me to control. YuWon put out some of the fire and looked around. The test site had descended into utter chaos. Dozens of players were already unable to fight anymore. There were a few players that were putting up a good fight against the Holy Fire, but they wouldn't last long. There's no way this is going to end here. This test was a stage set up by Olympus to get YuWon. There was no way. The only trap they had set up for him was inconveniencing him by ruining the balance of the teams. YuWon knew that the players would be able to endure the holy fire with the help of buffs from Roll. So he did not care about them. He wondered how many buffs Roll would be willing to use in this battle. In a hurry, Roll directed her skills that the players spread around her. She made their bodies lighter, protected their bodies from the fire, buffed their strength, and more. She had used over 10 types of buffs on her team. Her abilities were so versatile that any team with her on board could double their power. But then why? What's up with this? Roel wondered. She started sweating seeing YuWon just standing still. She was unable to stop the fire YuWon controlled with her skills. On top of that, the dozens of players were busy running from the fire as if they were put under some illusion. No matter how powerful a buff she cast, nothing would change. She couldn't stop the fire, nor could they injure YuWon, let alone approach him. Roel grits her teeth, focuses her sights, and aims her hands at YuWon. She specialized in healing and buffing, but those weren't the only abilities she had. If that were the case, she wouldn't have managed to become nearly as famous as she was. Above YuWon's head, a giant yellow, glowing sword appeared. It was the divine skill, Sword of Execution. It was the only attack skill that the angel Roel possessed, but that was good enough because this skill was said to be one of the most lethal man-to-man attack skills. YuWon was pressed under the huge pressure of the sword. Die! Roel shouted as she swung her hands down. The sword made of light above YuWon's head fell toward him. In response, YuWon, who had been standing still all this time, drew his sword. Through the blinding light, Roel could see her sword getting shattered. The Sword of Execution. Roel's eyes widened. The shock from what she witnessed made her numb to the blinding light. Her Sword of Execution was destroyed, not even by some special skill, but from a normal swing of a sword. YuWon just casually swung his sword and destroyed the Sword of Execution. The Sword of Execution upon destruction released a powerful light, enough to light up the whole forest. The sword shattered into tiny pieces that floated throughout the vast sky. Roel and the other players heard the loud ringing caused by the collision. It echoed in their ears. Roel had a flashback of what Hyun told her. We will all die. Roel's eyes locked on YuWon. She felt a shiver down her spine and even took a step back subconsciously. There didn't seem to be anything she could do against him. This is cheating, she muttered. After looking around, Roel noticed that most of the players had already run away. She changed her mind. There's no point in fighting anymore. Hyun was right. Roel didn't know what made him come to that conclusion, but YuWon was not an opponent they could face. Even though he was still only a player, his strength was beyond their measure. Roel bit her lip. Everyone, let's retreat, Roel telepathically communicated to all the players of Team B that had received a buff from her. We don't stand a chance. If all of us die here, even if we get his king, we will still lose this test. After hearing Roel's words, the players of Team B looked at one another and nodded their heads. Their original plan was to get YuWon and the king, but currently, both seemed impossible. Make sure you leave your flags behind, YuWon said out loud. This caught Roel off guard. Did you hear all that? She asked. YuWon responded, I don't need to hear anything to know what's going on in your head. And if I say we're just going to leave? Roel asked. I won't let you guys go, said YuWon. So don't waste your energy, and just leave them behind, YuWon continued while signaling with his fingers to hand the flags over. You obtained 8 flags. You obtained 80 CP. After contemplating, Roel ended up handing her flags over. As expected, she had quite a few flags on her. This was one more than the 7 flags that Hyun had on him. A support plays a bigger role in the team than a lone swordsman, so that makes sense, YuWon thought. It was a natural way for a team to distribute the gains. The other players followed Roel and handed YuWon their flags. Will you really not kill anyone? Roel asked as YuWon was finishing up collecting the flags. YuWon nodded. Since he got all their flags, there was no need to kill anyone. How come? You don't seem like someone who'd hesitate to kill people, asked Roel. That's true, but I don't particularly like killing either, YuWon replied. Roel continued and said, Will you really be okay? You might be taking all our flags, but we'll just go collect more. You're by yourself. You might lose your king, and with the remaining time. Are you asking me to kill you? YuWon asked. After getting goosebumps from locking eyes with YuWon, Roel took a few steps back. What is it that you want? YuWon followed up with another question. A talk with you, she responded. I heard that you rejected all the sponsorship offers from major guilds. YuWon nodded his head. Why did you do that? She asked. What is this? Is this a recruitment offer? YuWon asked. Zion can offer you the best treatment possible. I'm certain they'll treat you even better than me, Roel spoke with a spark in her eyes. YuWon couldn't believe she was making such an offer when just a moment ago they were fighting over the flags. So she's sponsored by Zion, YuWon thought to himself. He was amazed that a player on the lower floors was already sponsored by such a major faction, but it made sense as Roel's ability fit them. No thanks, YuWon rejected her offer. Why? Roel asked. It's annoying, having to repeat myself. Just leave. She continued on, then at least give me your kit number. I'm always happy to get a number from a beauty. That is, unless they have an ulterior motive, YuWon said while shooing her away, so just go. Whether it's Zion or Asgard, I have no intention of joining anywhere. Why? Roel refused to give up. Without her persistent personality, she probably wouldn't have managed to make it this far so quickly. She continued, Why are you rejecting all the offers from these major guilds? I'm sure you're aware, but the tower isn't a place you can conquer by yourself. If you have something you desire. She further continued, it's impossible to climb this tower alone. A good team as well as a good guild. You need them both to climb the tower as high as you want. You should have realized it too. You need things other than just abilities. Why the hell are you trying to do such a healing thing alone? Asked Roel. YuWon got irritated by the continuous babbling of Roel. He knew that if he had joined a guild he would have been able to climb the tower faster. But joining the guild will only interfere with his goals. The guilds were naturally against one another, but it was the worst among the major guilds that were trying to gain the rights to the tower. And the major guilds had been at this for too long. For far too long there had been rivalries, suspicion, and pride. So in order to bring them together as one, there needed to be a new center. So YuWon had to go through all of this alone to become that center. It is possible that YuWon cut Roel off with an annoyed tone, even without a major guild. No, I have to solo it. Now stop being so noisy and go away. If you stay any longer, you might actually die. What? Roel asked in shock, staring at YuWon. The other players had already dispersed, and Roel realized she was the last one there. She nodded her head and answered, I understand. Well, I hope I'll get to see you again. And hopefully, we'll be on the same team next time. Roel turned around. YuWon watched her back for a second before adding, sorry, but the king won't die. Roel turned her head back towards him. YuWon continued while playfully waving his hand, so you should just root for me losing. What do you mean? Roel asked in confusion. Now carry on, YuWon told her to go. Despite her confusion, she decided to keep moving. While on the other side, Hyun felt like he was going through a horror experience. He was in a situation where he didn't know when or where players from Team B would come after him. At least currently things were quiet thanks to YuWon drawing their focus. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay, he repeated to himself. Hyun forgot to even blink. A spear or an arrow might come flying at him at any moment, like earlier, so in order to dodge, he couldn't afford to even blink for a second. His legs slid a little. Hyun desperately wanted to run away that very moment, but... Circle. Every time he even thought about it, YuWon's voice echoed in his head. Don't leave the circle. Hyun wondered if he should run away or if he should stay there and wait as YuWon ordered him to. Please come back sooner. Hyun decided that he had no choice but to accept his fate and wait for YuWon. After some time passed. Finally, a skill came flying towards Hyun. Fire exploded above his head. He managed to dodge it by ducking quickly, but the embers from the explosion still scattered on top of him. Embers fell on Halaman's back. He wanted to let out a scream, but he didn't have a chance to do that. Did he dodge it? So he at least has some reflexes. But why is this guy just standing here? Halaman heard some voices in the bushes. I don't know. Maybe he's asking to be killed. 5 players revealed themselves from the shrubbery. They were players of Team B. In an instant, they surrounded Halaman so he couldn't get away and started chattering. Let's finish this quickly. Things seem to be going pretty rough over there. Are they really struggling to get one guy? Kim YuWon really must be as amazing as they say. Halaman managed to get a grasp of how things were going from the 5 players' conversation. Really? By himself? Halaman thought in amazement. He wasn't sure when he saw YuWon leave confidently by himself, but it seemed that YuWon was really fighting against them on his own. And somehow YuWon was the one who was winning. That is amazing. Halaman thought, ready to burst into tears, but what about me? It was impossible for YuWon to get here in time from so far away. I need to run away. Halaman took a few steps back, his foot landing on the line. It was the line that YuWon had drawn, and unfortunately what YuWon said rang in his head. Damn it! Halaman muttered, remembering YuWon's order to stay within the line at all costs. He brooded over YuWon's warning. It wasn't like he had a chance of running away from the 5 players in front of him anyway. He clenched his fist and thought, if I buy time without leaving this circle, YuWon SSI will definitely return. So the best way is to believe and follow his words. Okay. Fine. Let's go, you bastards! Halaman shouted, drawing his sword. It was a rash decision. The players in front of him might not have been on the level of Hyun or Roel, but they were still among the top players on the 11th floor. In contrast, Halaman had failed to pass the 11th floor test multiple times now. I can do it, Halaman thought to himself while gritting his teeth. I can do it! The players from Team B started muttering. You're so pathetic. Hey, let's finish this already. Let's divide the CP equally. Okay? The players blinded by CP approached Halaman, now within a few steps of him. Without leaving the circle, Halaman swung his sword with everything he had. The sword hit nothing but dead air. Instead of hitting, he got pushed back to the border. He managed to stop himself from going out of the circle. Damn it, I should not leave the circle, Halaman thought. As he looked above, a player was already in the air, charging at him. The player instantly kicked Halaman in the gut, resulting in him falling down. The player who kicked Halaman said, "What is this? That is just too easy." Team B players that ambushed Halaman must have thought about cautions and measures to counter, but after clashing face to face, they realized Halaman to be a coward and weakling. The player picked up Halaman from the collar and raised him high in the air. He was still mumbling to himself, believing in YuWon. If I don't leave the circle, YuWon will come to save me. The enemy player got irritated and said, "What are you mumbling about? No one is gonna save you. Farewell. Just blame your bad luck." After speaking, he threw Halaman on the ground. While pressing him with one hand, Team B player raised his sword high, getting ready to kill the king. Suddenly a huge foggy hand appeared behind the player. The hand grabbed the player trying to kill Halaman and threw him high in the air. The players watching from far away were stunned and confused as to what had happened. What is that? A ghost? Is this his skill? The players were taken aback by the domineering mana. They had expected this to be an easy hunt, but here an unexpected obstacle had popped up. Halaman looked at the circle that YuWon had drawn on the ground. Then his gaze moved to the thing standing at his back as if protecting him. It was shrouded by the smoke, but there was something there that resembled a person. And that something had protected Halaman. Halaman laughed nervously. His legs shook, feeling weak. There was only a single thought that filled his mind: he was going to live. A YuWon skill, the heavenly demon spirit. YuWon stood in place and waited for everyone to disappear. YuWon had already wasted a lot of time in the conversation with Roel. He wanted to end the conversation a bit faster, but Roel kept on chattering. But as it is all over and there will be issues from Team B's side, as long as Halaman kept his promise, YuWon would be able to deal with the problems that lie ahead easily. YuWon activated his cinder eyes and turned to look in a direction. Now the only thing that is left is... After a few minutes had passed. Everyone's gone, YuWon stated. A sound came from behind YuWon in a direction where no one was visible. Then out of nowhere, a gold light appeared. How long were you aware? For a while now, YuWon said while turning around, meeting face to face with Team B's king. A man without a face, glowing gold, the light that symbolized the king. This man had moved alone to get YuWon. You're as smart as the rumors say you are, not to mention you're also skilled, the king said. He looked around the surrounding area and was pretty impressed. After such a fight, it wouldn't have been strange if a big fire had engulfed the forest. But instead of a fire, there weren't even any traces of scorch marks. There were plenty of skills with great firepower, but the king had never heard of a skill that could burn selective targets like this. A fire with a will. If he saw it, he'd want it, the king mumbled while nodding his head. What's the test examiner doing here, wearing that weird mask? YuWon's question shocked the king. Even though his eyes, nose, and mouth were obscured to the point that no one could recall them, YuWon could see him as clear as day. The king was no ordinary player. It was the test examiner Hypnos, a ranker. You can see me? Hypnos asked. Crystal clear, YuWon replied. Earlier, YuWon's eyes had changed into cinder eyes. They were eyes that could see through everything as well as discern lies and truth. Even if the player in front of him was a ranker, with just a simple illusion disguise, he couldn't beat the discernment of cinder eyes. That's not possible, Hypnos said. Sometimes the impossible happens, YuWon replied. You really are something, Hypnos continued. It was a short conversation, but Hypnos was truly amazed. Even though he was found out, he didn't take off his disguise. It would be terrible if people found out that Olympus's test examiner had intervened in a test. I was honestly surprised. I didn't think that you'd choose to go after all the players rather than aim for the king. Hypnos took on the role of the king for one reason. He had assumed YuWon would immediately go after the king as soon as the test started because he wanted a situation like this. The opportunity to face him one-on-one. But rather than searching for the enemy king, YuWon moved at a leisurely pace and then picked a fight with the elites of Team B. I finally understand why the higher-ups are so up in arms about you. A faint shimmer spread out from Hypnos. The faint flow of mana slowly diffused. As his vision and mind became hazy, YuWon tried his best to keep it together. Hypnos was a ranker famous for his illusion skills. So, they even mobilized a test examiner, YuWon thought. YuWon drew out his mana and lit the holy fire ablaze. This was a fight he couldn't win just by taking it easy like earlier. What a mess, YuWon thought. An officially registered ranker had intervened in a test. Olympus had taken a huge risk considering the trouble they would be in if the administrator found out. YuWon couldn't help but smirk. YuWon knew that they had laid out a trap for him. How nice, he thought. In contrast to the fight against the players, the holy fire burned big and loud. Within the dark, changed landscape, Hypnos watched YuWon endure his mana. Most players would have long fallen asleep already. Even fairly skilled players should have been affected by the mana and felt drowsy. But YuWon was perfectly fine, which meant it was one of two scenarios. Either YuWon's arcane power stat was high enough to resist his mana, or his willpower was just that amazing. Hypnos thought that the former was unlikely. His willpower is probably great, Hypnos concluded. About 10 days before the test, Hypnos received a message from Olympus. The message was short but shocking. Knowing the possible major ramifications, Hypnos was deeply worried. A test examiner's role was to oversee possible accidents during a test or remove unfair elements in addition to managing and setting up the tests. I did think it was a crazy order, Hypnos thought. Fortunately for Hypnos, it wasn't that difficult of an order. However, to think that Lady Hera would show interest as well. Right before the test began, Hypnos got a message from Hera, a high ranker of Olympus. Kill Kim YuWon at any cost. The method doesn't matter. At first, Hypnos thought that maybe he was going a bit overboard, but it wasn't unwarranted, he thought to himself. The mana that was dispersed into the air started to become darker in color. And finally, Hypnos' skill activated Dark Night. Instantly, YuWon started wobbling. Hypnos smiled. I got him, he thought. Dark Night was the skill he had used the longest and the skill that got him to where he was. As a hallucination-type skill, it forced any living beings inside its reach to fall into sleep. Hypnos thought that YuWon was probably using everything he had to not fall asleep right now. It's hard, isn't it? Hypnos said, walking towards YuWon. Just give in. You can have a sweet dream if you just close your eyes. His words were sweet. Most people gave in to these words, and YuWon was no different. YuWon's eyes slowly started to close, and he stopped wobbling. Hypnos let out a smile. YuWon fell asleep while standing. It's over, Hypnos presumed. Everyone had a desire to sleep, and Hypnos possessed the ability to draw out that desire and force people into sleep. The timing was good. Right now was the time of day when Dark Night exhibited the greatest power. Hypnos started walking closer to YuWon. Due to releasing his mana in quite a large radius, the penalty started affecting him a little bit. It wasn't good for him to drag this out. Hypnos pulled out the dagger that he had hidden within his clothes. No matter how good he is with the sword, he's still just a player on the lower floors. Hypnos spoke while pointing the dagger at YuWon's neck. I don't know what's going on, but don't resent me too much. It's your fault for getting on the bad side of Olympus. Hypnos' knife started shining. He continued, if a normal player like you bragged that you fought an Olympus ranker, it would have been a ridiculous situation. People will argue whether your abilities are on par or not. Whether Olympus is good or not. It is an honorable situation for you. You could have bragged if you were to live. Now then, it's time to finish this. Hypnos raised his sword close to YuWon's neck and was about to cut him. But Hypnos took a step back, but he was a moment too late. A deep cut ran through his chest. The dispersed mana returned to Hypnos' body. He tried to treat his wound quickly through mana control, but the wound was too deep to treat that way. A dense mana was enveloping YuWon's sword. It appeared to be a pretty advanced arcane sword. Hypnos knew that it couldn't be some ordinary skill, considering it damaged the body of a ranker like him. It was shallow, YuWon muttered in disappointment. Lightly swinging his sword to shake the blood off the blade, he looked completely fine and awake, even just that moment ago. You bastard. Hypnos grits his teeth. Was that all an act? YuWon didn't answer his question, which Hypnos took as a silent admission. It was obvious that it was an act. If YuWon had fallen to Hypnos' skill, he wouldn't have even been able to swing his sword. From the beginning, YuWon was aiming to close the distance between them to get a one-shot. Such a cowardly act. Hypnos accused him. YuWon retorted, I don't think you're in any position to speak. That shut Hypnos up because he was right. No matter how talented YuWon was, he was still a player that had just arrived on the 11th floor. YuWon continued trying to taunt and provoke Hypnos. He said, I don't really want to brag about fighting a ranker. Well, I guess I can mention a story of naive and spiteful examiner and Olympus for fun. Well, that doesn't matter, Hypnos grunted, his hand pressed tight to his wound. You're still just a player. The results aren't going to change. No, YuWon said while looking around. His surroundings were still dark thanks to the effect of Dark Night. YuWon continued, this does change things. Black mana started flowing out of the sword in YuWon's hand. The flow of mana was ominous. It was the dark attribute mana from the edge of nightfall. Affected by the skill, Dark Night, your stamina and mana recovery improves. The night didn't just belong to Hypnos. YuWon loved the sensation of mana overflowing in his body. That's the shit, he thought to himself. His grip on his sword strengthened. Edge of Nightfall was no perfect sword. It had the restriction that it could only exhibit its full power in night or darkness. That was a huge negative. But right now, not only was it a night, but Hypnos' skill was creating a near-perfect darkness. And in a situation like this, it's the perfect item. YuWon controlled his breathing while sharpening his senses. He might have been able to injure him, but his opponent was still a ranker. He couldn't afford to be relaxed. Hypnos is a ranker that specializes in illusions. Fortunately, YuWon already knew a bit about Hypnos. His battle position is a close-range mage, and he utilizes dark attribute mana, ideal for illusion-type skills. But he is still a ranker for Olympus. While YuWon was pondering, Hypnos was still adjusting to the deep cut on his chest. He was not expecting YuWon to be able to use the night to his advantage. YuWon's eyes had a glow in them. He could feel the overflowing power of the holy fire and the dark divine crystal. Both of YuWon's arms started to inflate from activating gigantification, and the holy fire wrapped around his sword. Hypnos's mana, which was spread out around the area, started to move. YuWon was confident against this kind of foe who liked fighting in the dark. The distance between the two people shortened, as both of them started running towards each other. Their fighting styles differed, but they both liked to have a similar distance between themselves and their opponent. Both of their swords clashed, and huge waves of mana erupted from their clash. The whole forest was illuminated by the result of their sword and mana clashing. In a matter of seconds their swords crossed a dozen times. YuWon retreated. His sword was covered with black mana due to the dark divine crystal. Hypnos did not wait and charged at YuWon instantly. Hypnos's sharp blade flew towards him. It moved fast and sharp, but YuWon didn't let the image fool him and quickly bent down to dodge the attack. YuWon activated the ability of Edge of Nightfall. Dark mana started gushing out of the sword, forming a form of aura blade over it. YuWon slashed Hypnos. The body got cut off. But soon Hypnos' body started disappearing. It was his clone. One of Hypnos' exclusive skills. Hypnos popped up right beside him. It was just another illusion. YuWon was able to see through all of Hypnos' illusions with cinder eyes. YuWon turned around instantly. The two different black-colored manas rippled throughout the area. But Hypnos was quite fast. He was able to reach YuWon's neck before he could even get in position to dodge or defend. But suddenly YuWon's divine fire raged and stopped Hypnos' sword in midair. The purple holy fire raged on, threatening Hypnos. Hypnos sliced the fire, and he was swallowed by his darkness. Every time the fire got close to him, a mysterious fear crept up on him. What is this skill? Hypnos wondered. This eerie feeling was there the first time he saw YuWon's fire. He had never seen a fire that was purple before, and for some reason, when he looked at it, it felt instinctively repulsive to him. But as his repulsion and fear increased, the fire burned hotter. Hypnos tried to defend against the fire over and over, but all in vain. As time passed, the flames started getting more aggressive and the heat of the fire itself started rising. Hypnos was unable to defend against it. Hypnos soon realized the true nature of YuWon's fire. It's not actually growing hotter. Hypnos stretched out his hand and snatched up the fire that was flying in midair. With the ability to turn dreams into reality, Hypnos was able to grab things that didn't have a physical form. The hand that he had grabbed the fire with felt hot, but it wasn't as hot as before. It just feels hot. It was a bizarre skill. Hypnos was shocked that it was able to provoke an opponent's fear and change in power proportionally to their emotions. Hypnos backed off as soon as he realized this fact. How troublesome, Hypnos said, shaking his hand. Sparks flew around him. It was a sign that the penalty was starting and a testament to how much power he had used. The holy fire was pushed aside in multiple directions. It was as if a huge hole was being opened up. YuWon hesitated for a second before swinging his sword. Mana exploded out of the dark divine crystal, adding power to the sword. With no more reason to pay attention to the holy fire, Hypnos focused his attention on YuWon. As the swords struck each other and slashed through the air, countless sword marks made imprints on the ground. As their swords clashed, countless sparks were created. Hypnos was always being pushed back by YuWon. He gritted his teeth and continued to clash with YuWon. The tower's penalty also kept on increasing. The two had now traded dozens of blows. the land below them was filled with countless sword strikes. It was a fierce battle. As more time passed, Hypnos became more and more impressed. This is unprecedented talent, he thought. At first, Hypnos had brushed him off, thinking, how great can a player on the 11th floor be? But that preconceived notion had now been smashed. Even after this long battle, YuWon still looked unfazed, as though he was not feeling any pressure at all. A player on the lower floors could never beat a ranker. That was a long-standing, unchangeable law. Every once in a while, among the elite purebloods were ones with great talent who managed to surpass rankers before they became a ranker themselves. However, that always happened after they had climbed pretty far up the tower. If he were to become a ranker in the future, Hypnos couldn't begin to imagine what kind of a monster YuWon would be. I can't let that happen. Hypnos finally understood why Hera cared about a lowly player. I have to kill him here, Hypnos resolved himself. Moon Dream, Hypnos used his ultimate skill. The penalty on Hypnos's body grew stronger. At the same time, a huge circle floated above their dark arena. It was as if a full moon was up alone in the night sky. After a moment, the moon started to rupture. Finally, it exploded. Shattered fragments of the moon started raining down with nowhere to escape. I guess you're not afraid of the administrator, YuWon stated. His words made Hypnos pause for a second. Even Hypnos's turbulent mana froze momentarily. But soon after, Hypnos bit his lip and responded, my only allegiance is to Olympus. What a joke, YuWon replied. Hypnos continued and said, say whatever you want. There's no way a brat who knows nothing like you would understand the greater cause. The sky and the ground shook. Greater cause, you say? You would not even be able to imagine the weight of the burden that I carry, YuWon muttered while watching the fragments of the moon coming at him. Keep this in mind. YuWon remembered what Chronos said when he first revealed the clock movement. Whoever is the one that uses this to go back in time, Chronos said while everyone was gathered around, they will have to carry the entire tower on their back. The tower was a collection of hundreds of different worlds. It was a world with trillions of living beings, and that world was on a trajectory heading towards doom. YuWon knew the end of the world. So the one who goes back needs to be capable of holding up that weight. This was what Chronos advised. YuWon only understood after coming back how truly heavy it was. There was no way for Hypnos to know the magnitude of the weight on YuWon's back. I may not, but I at least know one thing, YuWon said to Hypnos. The greater cause, YuWon didn't truly know what it meant either, but he was sure of one thing. The thing about the greater cause, YuWon snickered at Hypnos, is that it's meant to be said when you're sacrificing yourself, not someone else. Like YuWon, who had gone back in time just to repeat that hellish fight once again. That's cooler, isn't it? YuWon asked. Between the two of them, YuWon had the greater right to talk about it. The fragments of the broken moon dropped on the ground, creating a huge rubble, covering the entire area. A huge noise along with dirt erupted from the rubble. As YuWon was squashed under the pile of rocks, the ground underneath buckled, unable to handle the weight. The user of the skill, Hypnos, was fine because none of the moon fragments fell around him. YuWon was now buried somewhere underneath the mountain of rocks. Cooler? Hypnos said bitterly. How dare you say that when you don't even understand Olympus's will? Hypnos clenched his fist tight. He was well aware that what he was doing right now was one of the unforgivable crimes in the tower, but he had no choice. Everything is for Olympus. Hypnos closed his eyes and repeated the same thing over and over in his head. For Olympus. Suddenly, a hot sensation pierced through his back and chest. Hypnos looked down and saw a black sword drenched in blood. He tried to speak but splurted out mouthfuls of blood. You should never let your guard down in a fight, YuWon said while pushing up on his sword. Hypnos grabbed the blade with his hand, using sheer force to barely stop his body from getting cut in half. However, he was unable to do anything about his hand getting torn apart by the blade. Along with incurring a powerful penalty, mana flowed out of Hypnos's body. This man was threatening enough for YuWon to pull the sword out of Hypnos's back and jump back a distance. The fragments of the moon around the place slowly started disappearing. As the scenery returned to normal, Hypnos had a shocked look on his face. How, he thought. Moon Dream was the strongest skill he had that he used in combination with Dark Night. It was a cheat-like skill capable of turning illusions into reality within the area of his mana. Moon Dream showed illusions of Hypnos's choice to his opponent. Even if his opponents suspected it of being an illusion, it was hard for them to be certain that the rocks falling right in front of them weren't real. That was the power of visions. And Moon Dream had the power to change that fear into reality. Two conditions were needed to nullify the skill. The first was to realize that the sight in front of them was an illusion. The second was to not feel even an inkling of fear after seeing the fragments of the moon fall on them. If one doubted whether it was real or not for even a second, the illusion became reality. Is it because of those eyes? Hypnos asked, staring at YuWon. YuWon's eyes were red. Hypnos sensed a peculiar flow of mana around them. At first, he didn't care since there were many eye-related skills, but it seemed that this was no ordinary skill. They are pretty good eyes, YuWon didn't deny it. It's not over yet, Hypnos said, clasping his wound and walking towards YuWon. If illusion-type skills don't work, I'll use another method. There's nothing better than the golden cinder eyes for illusions, YuWon thought to himself. No, YuWon cut him off, putting down his bloody sword. It's over. What? Hypnos said in confusion. He knew that he wasn't in a great state, but for YuWon to lower his guard so much. On top of that, YuWon started to calm his fighting spirit. Is he trying to catch me off guard again? Hypnos wondered. However, Hypnos was no longer going to underestimate YuWon. YuWon had exhibited far too great a strength for him to do that anymore. Hypnos's eyes glared while he gripped his dagger tight. I will slit his throat this time, Hypnos thought to himself. Penalty overflowed from Hypnos's body. Hypnos had no intention of going easy anymore since he now knew YuWon could see through his illusions. However, he could not move his dagger, as if a powerful force had taken hold of his weapon. Behind you, YuWon said while smiling. Look who's here. Cold sweat started gathering on Hypnos's forehead. He didn't have to be told to know who would have arrived at a moment like now. Hypnos carefully turned his head around to see a mean-faced, red-skinned, giant man. Sir? Hypnos trailed off. It was the 11th floor's administrator who had given Hypnos his position as the test examiner. Fragments flew into Hypnos's face as the dagger broke. Hypnos blinked, and the administrator was a step closer to him. Explain this, the administrator demanded. Hypnos felt like his entire body was being squashed. The inside of his mouth felt dry, and a cold sweat ran down his forehead. Sir, the thing is... Hypnos tried to make an excuse but couldn't come up with anything. He turned his gaze to YuWon, and saw that YuWon was watching him with his arms crossed. YuWon was a participant in this test. It was obvious who the administrator would side with in this situation. It was likely that the administrator already knew the full situation, seeing how he bothered to show up in person. Hypnos had used his powers to the limit that the penalty allowed, so it would have been strange if the administrator was unaware of the situation. This all happened because the fight dragged on longer than he had expected. As he trailed off, Hypnos turned his entire body towards the administrator and got on his knees. I'm sorry, sir. Hypnos bowed his head. So at least you're sorry, the administrator said. I committed a grave sin, sir, Hypnos continued. Was this an order from Olympus? Hypnos was startled by what the administrator asked. The administrator nodded his head after seeing his reaction. So I'm right. Under whose order was it? Ares? Hera? Or Zeus? Said the admin. Hypnos shouted, it was my own decision. But he then quickly lowered his voice after realizing he shouted unconsciously. This was your own decision. The administrator scoffed. It was a lie that even an idiot wouldn't believe. So you want to take the blame? That's not it, sir. Hypnos tried to speak but was cut off by the administrator. But even if that really were the case, Olympus can't escape all of the blame. The administrator's words shocked Hypnos. His loyalty to Olympus was great, to the point that he had already put his life on the line by personally going after a test participant. But by no means did he ever intend to bring harm to Olympus. Effective immediately, your position as the test examiner will be revoked. And I shall also be taking away all authority given to Olympus on the 11th floor, the administrator said in a firm voice. Sir! Hypnos tried to make a rebuttal. How dare you raise your voice? The administrator shouted at him. Hypnos, who was trying to stand up, had his body fly back several meters due to the pressure from the admin's roar. He then got crushed back down, his face getting firmly pressed into the ground. Hypnos grunted in pain. Of course, it won't end with just taking your position as a test examiner. Messing with a test participant as an examiner is an unforgivable crime. You will be punished for thousands of years, in a state between life and death. The test examiner was an important job. They managed floors tests and weeded out any cheating. Because of the importance of the job, test examiners were given huge influence and authority inside the tower. Hypnos was shocked. He tried to rebuttal, but, "We'll talk more later, Hypnos," said the administrator. Hypnos's body began to get sucked into the ground. He glared at YuWon while he disappeared. YuWon was unfazed. He knew more than anyone about the tower rules. He just stood unfazed, looking at Hypnos getting sunk into the ground, and waved at him. Once that was over, the administrator turned his gaze to YuWon. So it's you again. This administrator already knew YuWon. That wasn't that big of a surprise. Administrators were beings that were hard to meet, yet YuWon was meeting his third administrator, and each time involved a situation that was out of the ordinary. Your name's Kim YuWon, isn't it? You really aren't an ordinary kid, said the admin. Thanks to you, I had quite a few troubles, YuWon responded while looking over at the spot where Hypnos disappeared. The administrator instantly understood what YuWon meant. Definitely not ordinary, he smirked. YuWon nodded his head. Administrators were terrifying beings. With power that matched the top high rankers, they had the ability to use the administrator's authority, which let them control a floor of the tower. In contrast to how the rankers were spread out throughout various guilds, administrators were consolidated. In other words, they were the rulers of this tower. However, that doesn't mean I have to be afraid right now, YuWon thought. As long as you didn't go against the law of the world, there was no reason to fear administrators. There have been quite a few oddities in this test, and if I'm not mistaken, a test examiner is the proxy of the administrator. YuWon made his case. The admin spoke, so you want me to take responsibility? Someone has to, YuWon replied. The administrator stared silently at YuWon. YuWon didn't avoid the administrator's gaze because he knew that the administrator wouldn't do anything to him in this situation since he was the victim here. You're not wrong, the administrator said with a look of amusement on his face. Okay. I promise to give you a reward when the test is over. And you won't go back on your words? YuWon asked. I'm an administrator. You shouldn't compare me with a bastard like Hypnos. An administrator's words were trustworthy as they were essentially the living, breathing system. Because of that, they would never do something like lying. I understand, YuWon said. Having received the answer he wanted from the administrator, he turned his attention. Now then. There were a few players watching what was going on. Namgung-hoon, YuWon noticed in particular. So we had quite the audience, the administrator said, shrugging it off and pretending that he wasn't aware. A big wave is coming. A big wave. Ha ha. The administrator put his hands behind his back and started walking away. The space in front of him tore apart, and he disappeared in an instant. Having been spectating for a while, Hyun and his companions were startled by the sudden disappearance of the administrator. A wave, he says, YuWon thought as he locked eyes with Hyun. I wonder. Hyun had had his suspicions while following the king, whose identity was unknown. A test examiner ranker going after a test participant player was the worst possible crime one could commit because it broke the laws of the tower. So it was true, Hyun said with a serious look on his face after he got the explanation of the situation from YuWon. Olympus. This is a massive incident. Are we sure it wasn't the independent actions of the examiner? Why would a test examiner do this on their own? Fucking hell. Should we remain silent about this? Do you think Hyun's personality would allow that? Hyun's teammates said while being conscious of him, but it was also something they all agreed on. Having witnessed this incident, their hands were tied. Olympus had committed a grave, forbidden crime. And if this incident became public, Olympus would take a massive hit. But did it really happen? His opponent was a ranker, and one who's powerful enough to be a test examiner. Hyun's teammates glanced over at YuWon. Fighting a ranker. That was a pipe dream for players on the lower floors because their ultimate goal for climbing the tower was to become a ranker. It's the first time since the Great Sage, Hyun thought to himself. This wasn't the first time a ranker had lost to a player. Sun Ogong, a current top high ranker who was also known as the Great Sage, Heaven's equal, had a record of crushing a ranker as a player. The test examiner of this floor is an Olympian ranker, Hyun continued to assess the situation. When this event became known, it would have an even bigger ripple than Ogong's incident. What to do, he wondered. Hyun finally decided to ask YuWon after thinking for a long time, what will you do? YuWon had already crossed the line he couldn't come back from with Olympus. Hyun didn't know why Olympus was aiming for YuWon, but it was obvious that YuWon would be marked as their enemy due to this incident. It was an impossible task for a single person to go against Olympus. Despite that, I will fight, YuWon responded. His answer was beyond what Hyun considered logical. YuWon continued until I dragged Zeus down to the bottom. As soon as Zeus's name was mentioned, Hyun felt his chest tighten. YuWon said the name of that giant way too easily. Hyun had to ask, how did you become enemies with Olympus? What in the world happened? I helped a blacksmith who was being forced to make weapons he didn't want to. YuWon was speaking about Hephaestus. Ever since then, they decided they wanted to kill me. A blacksmith, you say? Hyun muttered. Hyun was a direct descendant of the Namgung clan. Because of that, he endlessly heard the news around the tower. Even though YuWon wasn't clear, Hyun was somewhat able to put together what was going on. I see, Hyun said while nodding. He then turned around and started walking away. Hey Hyun! Where are you going? His teammates started chasing after him. It's almost time for the Grand Martial Arts Tournament, Hyun responded to them while taking out his player kit. We're returning to the Namgung clan. He messaged his father, the head of the Namgung clan and the guild master of the martial guild, Namgung Jinwon. Afterward, the 11th floor's test continued under the supervision of the administrator. There was nothing to stop YuWon now. Time passed, and the 24 hours were close to coming to an end. I really thought I was going to die, Halaman said to YuWon. After seeing YuWon, his legs gave out, and he fell to the ground. He was surrounded by blood, but none of it belonged to Halaman. Rather, it was the blood of players from Team B who had wanted to kill Halaman to win the test. All those players had been forced to run away while spilling their blood, unable to achieve their goal. But you didn't, YuWon answered nonchalantly. Halaman shook his head, having experienced what felt like an eternal hell. Multiple times he had thought about giving up on the test. YuWon stared at Halaman for a moment. He was confused as to why YuWon was staring at him, so he asked, what happened? Have I done something wrong? You did well holding out and not giving up, YuWon complimented him. Halaman lifted his head upon hearing that, noticing a red flag. It was all the flags YuWon had gathered so far. 618, that was the number on the flag. Halaman laughed in disbelief. Many thoughts were running through his head. The test was almost over, and with so many flags, he would be able to receive a tremendous amount of CP, which meant a big reward. But right now, Halaman wasn't laughing because of that. I did it, Halaman thought. He was happy and proud of receiving a compliment from YuWon, and that he'd managed to endure it without giving up. I did it. Halaman's hand shook while reaching for the flag. Halaman was Team A's king who had managed to win the 11th floor's test with YuWon. As soon as YuWon handed over the flag to Halaman, both of them got the same message. The total flags totaled up to 1236 because of the king's benefit. You obtained 618 flags. The total will be multiplied by 2. You have obtained 1236 flags. Messages were popping up for players who had participated in the 11th floor test. And a moment later. Final number of flags. Team A, 1236 flags, and Team B, 2 flags. Hallam's eyes flickered as he watched the messages. Another message popped up exclusively for YuWon. You have received 10,000 points. The test was now over. Sun rises far away between the mountains. The system notified YuWon, you may move to the next floor. As soon as he arrived on the 12th floor, YuWon immediately found himself lodgings for a hefty price. He then checked the ranking board on the 11th floor. Kim YuWon's name was on the top with a total of 22,360 points achieved. A new record was set once again on the 11th floor. A player who managed to break the record of Zeus, a high ranker and king of Olympus, had appeared. After checking the rankings, YuWon took a look at his contribution points again. A CP of over 20,000. This was a number YuWon had not expected. He would have been satisfied just getting over 10,000 CP, yet he had scored double that amount. This was because of one reason. You have been awarded additional CP for an unknown reason. You have obtained 10,000 CP. This was a message that only YuWon got. It was likely YuWon's special reward for defeating Hypnos. The administrator had kept his promise. It wasn't as big of a reward as he had expected, but YuWon had no complaints. So he got 36th place. Hallam, who passed the test with YuWon, ended up with a pretty high ranking. It was thanks to the 5 flags he had on hand and the 600 flags he got from YuWon, netting him over 6,000 CP. It was a pretty incredible record since 36th put him above most high rankers. As for Hargan, YuWon skimmed over the new 11th floor rankings. There were quite a few familiar names. Ogong was ranked 11th, which was pretty low considering his skills. But that was because he wasn't suited for team-based tests like this. Odin was 4th, and Hercules was 3rd. Then he spotted another familiar name that popped out to him. Hargan at the 6th place gained 7,860 CP. There wasn't a big gap between 4th and 6th place. It was close enough that Hargan could have gotten 4th if he had obtained just a few more flags. That's impressive. YuWon saw Hargan's records here and there. Hargan was steadily raising his rankings while climbing the tower, and now finally on the 11th floor, he got a result that matched the great beings of the tower. He's certainly changed. Hargan was originally brimming with talent. What changed was the tutorial and his meeting with YuWon. YuWon had no way of knowing what kind of stimulus he provided to Hargan, but it was a fact that he had essentially given a tiger wings with the tutorial's reward. And right now, Hargan was using those wings to climb the tower with better results. YuWon pondered, I wonder how he looked now. I am curious to meet him. That's all for today. If you like the next part of this manhwa, just comment below. Thanks for watching, and please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment to get epic content on this channel. See you next time.